Erzsébet Benedict survived the war in the Budapest ghetto along with her mother. At the end of the war, she stood on a line for bread, and there a Russian soldier caught her eye. His name was Sam Jack Kliger, a Polish Jew, who somehow became a partisan and a Russian soldier. And there they met. A year later, they were married in Italy, and that's where Jack comes from. So this most unusual story of all faiths meeting gives us another story tonight. Jack.
So I'm a trustee of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, proud to be so. But I'm here because I'm a child of survivors, and I am an immigrant who came here with my family. When I was 3 years old, my parents had myself and my baby sister. And after we came to the United States, 2 years later, my mother had a third child, and that caused her to contract tuberculosis. And she was unfortunately had to be isolated immediately and was placed in a sanatorium in Bedford, in Upper Westchester. We had no family that could take care of us, and therefore my sisters were placed in foster care, and I, at the age of 6, was placed in an orphanage. And I was there for, is that better? I was there for 2 years. We were reunited after 2 years. Our family came together again, and my parents, either they couldn't or they wouldn't discuss it and talk about it, but they decided they wanted to move on and they wanted their family to move on. So for me, that was just an empty chapter in my life. There were no history, no stories, no memories, no photographs. And so we moved on. I was the first person in our family to graduate from college. I enjoyed a certain amount of career success, but I always had a very great fear of getting married and having children. I overcame that, and in my mid-30s, I did marry and have a child, and that inspired me to get involved with this organization. I worked with the organization for a number of years and was very committed to its mission of remembrance and education. Personal remembrance is sometimes a much harder thing than institutional remembrance. And I decided at first to try and find out about that place that I had been in for 2 years, and this was 30 years ago, and I knew the name of the place was Homecrest, and I looked up the records. It was in Yonkers, New York, but unfortunately it had been closed and torn down and made into a shopping center, and that was all I did about that at the time. I went forward and at one point decided that I wanted to interview my mother. My father, Shalom, passed away, but I wanted to interview my mother and hear more about her story. And this was for the first time that we actually talked about what had happened during that time. And she shared with me her sadness and her great shame at having gone through all of that and then not being able to take care of her own children. And I told her that there was nothing she could have done. She had no choice. And it was very important, I believe, for her to hear me say that and for me to tell her that. But that gave me another mission, and that was to find out more about my own experience. And this time, I had a much better set of research tools. I had the internet, and I also had a very committed nephew to help me do my research. And we went online, and we found a tremendous amount of information about Homecrest. Homecrest was actually the Hebrew National Orphans Home, established in 1912 on the Lower East Side to help orphans and children destitute children whose parents could not take care of them, many of them from immigrant families. And 40 years later, I think I was one of the last immigrant children to be put up in the home. But I found an amazing amount of information about the Hebrew National Orphans Home. It was an incredible institution. At one time, it had an active alumni association that had over 1,000 Jewish men who had been taken in as boys by the home. They sold out the Waldorf Astoria for dinners once a year. Famous writers like E.M. Nathanson, who wrote The Dirty Dozen, had been at the home. In fact, the Hebrew National Orphans Home had some of the best basketball players in Westchester. They played with jerseys that said HNOH with a Star of David underneath. And in fact, they were the feeding ground for Roosevelt High School, which was right next door. And in the early 50s, Roosevelt High School won a regional championship, and 4 of the 5 starters were boys from Hebrew National Orphan Home. One name kept popping out, Rick Safran. He had written a book about growing up as an orphan. He had also been the editor of the alumni newsletter. And with the help of my nephew, I tracked down Rick, and actually he was living in Manhattan and a retired school principal, lived there with his wife Shirley. And I got in touch with Rick, we met, we had a wonderful set of meetings. I felt an immediate intimacy with him even though we had never met before. He left just as I had arrived in 1953. And through Rick, I was able to connect with Eugene Suttenberg, who had been my bunkmate in the home. And we met. Eugene lives in Wilton, Connecticut, and the 3 of us got together, have shared many stories, many memories, and in fact, Rick found a photograph of me that was the first photo that I had ever seen of one of the women from the Ladies Auxiliary taking me out on my 7th birthday at the home. So I spent most of my life with that story being an empty chapter in my life and feeling very disconnected and feeling that it was a dark place. And I felt now that having met people who had shared my experience and who I felt I was connected with, the darkness turned into more light. My mother and I have made peace on this. And I have photographs, I have memories, and I have stories. And I thought that that story was very appropriate to tell in this place, which is dedicated to our shared experience and our shared history. And the credo of the home was survive, grow, and flourish. I think he gave me some very good lessons. I'm very glad that my lovely wife, Amy, is here tonight, but I'm also very glad that my new old friend, Rick Safran, and his wife, Shirley, are here tonight.